Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Charles Yang, who's a professor in linguistics at University of Pennsylvania. So Charles graduated from MIT, the AI lab. That was before it was CSAIL, before they had the crazy building. And his work is really quite fascinating. It's really kind of at the intersection between a lot of the computational things that we do and linguistics. And he's done some really interesting work in recent years on modeling language change, and he's going to talk about predicting language change. I'll include a shout out for his book that came out a couple years ago called The Infinite Gift. It is really an excellent book for those of you who either know quite well or don't know at all the kind of the modern Chomskyan linguistics and universal grammars and language learning, all these things. It's a wonderful book. I read it this summer. I've been recommending it to all my friends, so I'll recommend it to you. And I'm really happy that Charles came here today to talk about his work. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Charles Yang.
Okay, well, thanks very much for having me here. Good memories of this place a few years ago. All right, language change. A lot of this work is really inspired by the study of biological evolution and the connection that's been known for a long time. So it's well known that when Darwin wrote his Origins, a lot of his ideas were influenced by the achievement of historical linguistics at the time. When by the time this was written, the Indo-European tree was more or less in place. Right? I won't read this to you. But since then, evolution has, of course, made a tremendous amount of progress, and so has the study of language. But I think this is a case where a quantitative or mathematical revolutions in order to study the dynamics of change of language, as well as to see whether we can achieve the same level of precision as they do in biology. So now, as we know, a lot of tools from quantitative genetics have been applied to language. So there's a lot of work classifying language families by using phylogenetic methods. But it should also be pointed out that this work probably also has its origin in linguistic work. This is Peter Buehlmann's work back in the early 70s. If you read the quantitative genetics, phylogenetic reconstruction literature, in early days you see this reference. Now it's no longer there. So you could really say that linguists studying language change, in some sense, preceded the study of biology. Now it's time to catch up. So what I'm going to show today is a synthetic model of language change, in a sense that we want to take the pieces of language change and understand them as precise as possible, because these processes, assuming our ancestors' brain the same as ours, can be studied by looking at currently young children. And then once we take a good understanding of language learning and processing and so on, then we can extrapolate from there to see whether we can construct a model of change to explain the history of language, right? Whether we can say whether some changes in language that happened in the past were indeed predictable. So in that sense, it's kind of doing the work of population genetics for language. So here's a very classic view that's parallel to be seen by both biologists and by linguists. You have genes developing to phenotype, next generation, and so on. In language, you have grammar, you talk, your next generation learn, you talk again. So this looking at change as an iterative process of transmission. So I'm going to, this is kind of the beginning of a line of work that tries to port an entire array of population biology models into language. So here we're going to look at the most basic model that's roughly equivalent of the change model of natural selection in biology. I'm going to give you two cases today. One's a study that finished a few years ago, but now with some refinements. We want to show that the change in word order in the history of French, which had a verb second order, now is no longer there, was in fact predictable. And also we'll say, this is probably more exciting, at least to most people, is to look at some changes that are currently happening. So I'm going to be talking about a change that's been documented very recently at the Massachusetts and Rhode Island border, the so-called cot-caught merger. You probably can't tell the difference because I have the merger. For a lot of people, those two words are actually different. So to try to understand under what conditions can a merger spread from one area to the other. Okay? So in both cases, I'd like to show that you can, once you have a model in place, you can actually derive numerical conditions on when the change is going to happen. And then you can go out and look at other historical data or look at what's happening now in the field to see whether those predictions are true. And what I do want to emphasize is that the models of learning and processing and so on are not going to be coming out of thin air. So they're trying to, at least I try to ground them as much as possible in the details of linguistic structure as well as what's known about language acquisition, language processing, and so on. So for those of you who know this is going to be trivial, I really want to draw out this analogy. So here's what biologists take to be a natural selection model for asexuals. Right? So you have two genes, let's say red eye or green eye, big A, small a. At some point in population, they have the proportion of P and Q. Let's say big A is slightly better than small a for whatever reason. And then the former would have a fitness of 1, and the small a would have a fitness of 1 minus s. S is usually a very small number in nature. And then you can measure s by various means, right? You can look at a natural population to see how many of them actually pass on, or you can do experiments with them by blasting them with gamma ray to see how many actually survive, and then come up with the value of s. Then you can go out there and see how the population actually changes. So here's a simple model, current generation P and Q. After selection, assuming a basic model of proportional survival, then you just renormalize the weights, and you get P prime, which is this expression here. And if you plot this over time, you get a classic S-shaped curve, just a change, right? So I like to show this is exactly happening in language change as well. So this is the idea that I've been working on for a while now, something I call variational learning. That inspiration is also from biology. So let's say you have two grammars, big A and small a. The child has access to them with probably P and Q. And these grammars may be innately given, or may be constructed due to the composition of the data. I don't really care at this moment. So you just go through this very simple process. This were first put forward by behavioral by behaviorist psychologists. This idea is kind of a predecessor to the perceptual idea. So every time you hear a sentence, you choose one of the two grammars, big A or small a, according to the probability. If you can analyze it, do we have a pointer here? We don't. If you can analyze it, you increase the probability somewhat by a linear function.
Pointer on the floor to your right.
On the floor to my right. Oh, this old-fashioned pointer, right? So otherwise you drop it, okay? Otherwise you decrease its value. By the science here, I mean this in very general ways. This could be whether a grammar can parse the input string, or could be a grammar results in, for a particular input token, results in a particular processing difficulty, however you want it. Okay? The main thing here is that this is a very simple model. You can plug in any grammar model, what a big A and small a actually are, into this. You basically have a perceptual learning model, right? The crucial thing here is that the evidence for this comes from the failures, comes from when a child makes systematic errors in their, say, syntax acquisition. They show evidence of the grammars that are not in the environment, but nevertheless biologically possible. So in this sense, that's being referred to as learning, as an unlearning process. And also in this case, the choice of grammar matters. So some models of grammar appears to give you the right results for child language acquisition, given this very general way of learning. But something like, say, a PCFG probably won't work. Okay, so if you want to, I can spend some time on why some choices of grammar models are better than others. But I'm not going to dwell on this at the moment. Okay, so this is, again, to see how the analogy between the two fields can be played out here. We can talk about fitness. So here's a particular way of defining it. So let's define the fitness of grammar, big A, small a, to be the probability that with which a grammar fails to analyze or clashes with the input. Okay, so two grammars, you can calculate this by looking at large corpora and so on. And this is something that we linguists or computer scientists can do, but it's not something the child needs to keep track of. Right? So it's a simple proof to show that if the two grammars have a penalty probability of big A, C, big A, and small a. If you let this learning to go on for a while, if the learning rate isn't too big, and they convert to this stable combination of the two. Okay, so it's clear that in a monolingual case where you only have one grammar, so one grammar is never penalized, the other grammar is penalized with some positive probability, then clearly the winner, a target grammar, is going to knock out the loser, right? But that's the case where you have no change. Yes?
Quick question. What does it mean to say that a grammar clashes with an input?
For example, if you've chosen a English type of grammar and which is in your head to learn German, with some probability German sentence is going to work, right? I mean, but in some other cases it's going to fail. That's when, so the probability with which you run into the sentences will be penalty probability for English the grammar in a German environment. Okay, so
Let me follow up. So this seems like a categorical definition, meaning you either parse the sentence or you aren't able to. There is no valid parse.
no, you could do it, however, in an empirically valid way. Let's say if it takes you more than 0.1, 0.5 of a second to do it, then you find. Then as long as the way of success and failure is well defined and empirically motivated, I'm fine with it. Right. In fact, that's important because we'll see. Yes.
So this is a constant base of input, not an evolving base of input,
Right.
right?
At the moment, right. The next slide is going to be changed. Monolingual case, no change, right? But when you have a mixture, you could have change. So this is namely the value of P of the grammar you're interested in. Let's say it may change from one generation to the other. And so here are some other very interesting and possibly profound questions. That one is that how does a linguistic variant get introduced in a population in the first place? Okay, so that's a very important question because we want to know what is the origin of a particular new form, right? But another question, which is what I'm more concerned with here, is what happens after a new variant has been introduced. Or anything we can say with certainty once a new form has been introduced. This new form could be introduced by, say, for example, language contact. That's one possibility. It could also be the case of the child mislearns, so you have an error rate that leads to some other grammar that's not generally environment. Right? All of these are possibilities, but I'm mainly going to focus on here. Once the variant has been introduced, in some cases we do understand how they're introduced. What can we predict what was going to happen next? So here I want to distinguish two kinds of changes because they're not. They appear to show up in different manners. One is that in many cases of syntactic and morphological change, the language user is essentially bilingual. You can see this by looking at historical texts where a single writer may be accessing forms that are generally not considered to be the same grammar in the modern sense, right? And sometimes it takes hundreds of years for the change to completion. Sometimes it takes even over 1,000 years. So in this case, you get one generation, let's say start with P0 and Q0, the numbers gradually change over time. Eventually, after a while, it becomes 1. Say the probability of the big A grammar, that's a new thing. Phonemic changes are different. I think it probably reflects the way phonological systems work. They seem to be happening far more rapidly. In fact, even a while ago, it's known that a phonemic change, like the merger thing we'll be talking about, can happen in about 10, 20 years. But the most recent work has shown this change can take place within a span of 2 or 3 years. Okay? So this is really talking about one generation of learning, right? So I think, and also given other research on the limit of bilingual acquisition or the mixture of learning the phonological system or phonetic system, when there are two languages, I'm not going to dwell on it here. It seems that the learner is doing something like a winner-take-all approach. So they're exposed to a mixture. They learn, as I described earlier. After one generation, they have probabilities of those two kinds of grammars. Then they seem to make a categorical decision going to stick with one of them. So I'm going to simply assume it's going to be a winner-take-all situation where one form is going to take over the other. Yeah?
Okay, what's an example of a change that happens in 2 to 3 years?
Cot-caught merger, happening in 2 to 3 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in this study, it's going on at the Massachusetts and Rhode Island border. Well, I'll come to that. Yeah. Right. So here's how the sort of the general way of analyzing this. You have two grammars. You're exposed to a probabilistic mixture of the two, big A and small a. Let's assume the two grammars are, at least to some extent, mutually incompatible, right? In some other cases, they are mutually compatible, in which case, if you draw a sample that's compatible with both grammars, nothing is going to happen. It's going to change the direction of change. But let's say this grammar, big A, has a probability of alpha of producing a string that the other guy can't handle. And similarly, is also beta, the other guy can't handle, right? Therefore, the probability of this guy being penalized is simply beta times Q. And the probability of small a being penalized is alpha times P. Then we plug into the learning equation we had earlier. So the next generation, the weight of P, namely the weight of A, namely P prime, is going to be this number. And if you simplify the term a little bit, you see this is exactly the equation for natural selection in asexual organisms in a biological population, right? I could have stipulated this is the way it works, but I wanted to show the learning model that I suggested earlier actually is empirically grounded, but also happens to give you the nice properties that of language change. So here, the crucial thing here is that if you take a grammar like big A, you look at this is now essentially you're looking at a monolingual grammar, right? You can measure the probability of this grammar generating a string that's incompatible with the other one. You measure those two numbers, that's all you need to see in the long run which grammar is going to win out. All right, so that's the basic way of analyzing this kind of outcome tree of dealing with two grammars. So let's look at some cases. Of course, if you plot this change over time, you get this S-shaped curve, which is not only observing biology, but also observing all virtually, well, a lot of certainly long-range changes in language. So now let's look at some cases. Okay, the first case is the change in the history of French. So Old French was a V2 grammar, at least to the very large extent. So it has a Germanic-like word order, so then, heard, they, right? So that's Old French. And this is modern French. As you can see, that word order is no longer possible. So Old French went from a V2 grammar to a non-V2 grammar. At the same time, not at the same time, crucially not at the same time, but also what happened was that Old French was a pro-drop language, like to some extent like Italian or Spanish, where the omission of the subject pronoun is possible. But that's generally not possible now in modern French. So two changes have taken place. I wanted to show that how verb second could be lost in this fashion. Okay? So far good? So far so good? Okay. So the idea is that you have a V2 grammar, you have SVU grammar. By assumption, the grammars are in your head to begin with, right? So every child that's learning a grammar, learning the grammar of English, has to knock out V2. That's a claim. But in this case, when you have an environment where two grammars are both present, then they go into a more dragged out kind of competition. So the competition is between those two grammars that happen to be playing out in the history of French. Right? So now let's estimate alpha and beta. Namely, if you take a V2 language, you estimate how many patterns, the percentage of patterns that language produces that are incompatible with SVO, that's your alpha, and you do the other way around, you get beta. Okay, so you do this, I did this. This is a very stable number throughout the history of the Germanic languages. It's about 30% of sentences produced by the V2 grammar is incompatible with the SVO grammar because the word order is X something else, verb, and then subject. However, if you do this, count something like a SVO language, like English, you see only 10% of English sentences are not SVO. Something like John often reads the paper, or quickly John read the paper, or something, right? So it's only a relatively small proportion of them. So you have your alpha here being 0.3 and beta here being 0.1. So in this case, the V2 loss to SVO should not be possible, contrary to the facts, right? So we have to do something else about it. And that's actually turned out to be relevant to the property. Yes?
Quick question.
Yeah.
So this 10% number is coming from child's English corpus?
Sorry, child-directed English. So,
right. So the sentences in that corpus are really, really simple. So
right.
The example you gave already sounds like something you wouldn't be saying to a child anyway.
You do, but okay, you never get to anywhere near 30%. I've done tree bank. You get something like 15 or something.
Okay.
Right, and some other. You never get anywhere close to 30%. So you should not be possible to lose. Jason, yes, to lose V2 under the most basic application of the thing here. Yeah.
So I'm willing to bet that some of the electrical engineers in the audience don't know what V2, SVO, and XVS and things like that.
Okay. Oh, okay. SVO is English, right? So subject verb, object. V2 is a case in Germanic languages. As long as the verb is in the second position, you're good. In a matrix sentence. I mean, some people here, know this better than me. So in German, you could say John likes Bill. Bill likes John, meaning John likes Bill. Right? Or happily, quickly saw John, Bill, meaning John quickly saw Bill. Okay, so as long as the first position is occupied by some phrase and the second position is the finite verb, you're good. Apologies. But this is kind of, you get an impossibility in result, right? So something else has to be going on. That happens to be the case of pro-drop. Okay, imagine you have a language where the subject pronoun is dropped occasionally, and then that changes the competition of the two grammars in an interesting way. So let's say so remember, these are the sentences that are compatible with V2 but not compatible with SVO. If you drop the subject, pronoun, the sentence becomes XV. And since you don't hear the pro anyway, you are free to postulate the pro on either side of a verb. So the sentence that's previously unambiguously pointing to V2 is now no longer evidence for is now compatible with the pro drop, with the subject drop, with the SVO grammar. But you do these things, the other way around, right? So for SVO, grammar, for sentence like SVO, because you could drop the subject pronoun, you can end up with a sentence like VO, which is now transparently not V2, right? So you have this double whammy effect of V2 grammar losing some of its advantage due to pro drop, and also the SVO language gaining some advantage in allowing pro drop. So the real competition is between two grammars, namely V2 prime, which is V2 plus pro drop grammar, against the SVO prime, namely SVO plus pro drop grammar. So far, okay? So as you will see, it's crucial for the pro drop property of French to be lost after verb second was lost. Okay, so now we just say that a subject can be either a pronoun or lexical NP. When it's a lexical subject, it can't be dropped. If the pronoun, you have a chance of being dropped. Let's say the probability of that is D. Okay, so you have the V2 grammar. Let's say the red highlights this incompatibility with the SVO grammar. It originally was 0.3, but once you drop it, this is now XV. Now it's now compatible with the V2 with SVO grammar. So you only have to count and here you can't drop it because you drop the subject here. You end up with a V1 structure, right? So you can't drop it when the subject is in initial position. You drop it here, you end up with these guys are going to be the evidence that goes against the SVO grammar. And for SVO grammar, though, this is primarily the sentences are subject verb, but you have 10% of the things here subject something else verb or something else subject verb. Now after this going through pro drop, you simply just work out all the combinations. I'm not going to do it here, but you can drop it. You can drop it in other positions. Since you don't have the V2 requirement, you can drop it wherever you want. Now you simply recollect the terms. The probability of a subject being a pronoun is A. The probability of subject pronoun being dropped is D. You recalculate the advantage or fitness values of alpha of two grammars. You end up with alpha prime is this, and alpha and beta prime is this. It's basic algebra, and I'm not going to go through here. Now, in order for this to happen, now we still have the term AD here, right? Which is two variables. But thankfully, we don't need to evaluate this explicitly, because if you set beta prime to be greater than alpha prime, you get this thing, namely, if A times D is greater than about 18%. What is A times D? A times A is the probability of having subject. D is the probability of the subject being dropped. So A times D is the percentage of null subjects, drop subjects in a language. So that means that whenever you reach the history of French text, you find a text where the percentage of omitted subjects is greater than 18%, then the V2 grammar had to be lost. Okay? And now you go look at the historical text. This is based on Ian Roberts' work. You see that by the 14th century, the percentage of null subjects is actually greater, much greater than what's required then to lose the V2 property. And so at this point, you can guarantee that the French property in French, V2 in French would be lost. Okay? So this is, as I say, it's crucial that the loss of pro-drop had to be later than V2. So the claim here is that a plain V2 grammar cannot be lost to SVO grammar. It can only be lost when V2 is combined with a pro-drop. Okay, so it's essential for this to take place later than pro-drop. That's indeed the case. So pro-drop in French actually dropped out 2 centuries after V2 was lost. But this actually also captures an interesting generalization that has not been observed before, namely, all the Western Romance languages that had verb second in its past had lost it. And all of those who lost it either had pro-drop or still have pro-drop. So French was a language that had pro-drop, then lost it later, but lots of other languages still have pro-drop, like Spanish, Italian, or Catalan, and so on. Right? So in this sense, we can predict the inherent instability of the V2 and pro-drop combination, and we can derive the numerical conditions under which the change would be irreversible. And to this extent, we can predict the history of French is going to play out the way they actually did. Yes, Mark?
So these texts range over about 32 years.
Yeah.
And it's pretty consistent in that range.
Right.
Do we have earlier texts or later texts that show kind of a curve of change?
Not at the moment, although they're building a historical French corpus now, so hopefully we'll be able to answer that soon. So there's a lot of questions one might ask, right? So one thing is that if this pro-drop and V2 combination is inherently unstable, as I claim, how did the language get V2 in the first place, right? So it's almost as if as soon as you have this, you should be able to lose it. As soon as you get any kind of V2, you must be able to lose it. You must be able to lose it right away. There's some controversy over this, but what appears to me, or at least what would force me to say, is that the origin of the V2 order in Old French was probably due to Frankish influence. Frankish was a V2 language. There seemed to be at least some fairly broad range of opinions to support that view. So it's this kind of case where V2 cannot spontaneously arise in a pro-drop language. And once you superimpose it on a language, it'll actually lose it. Jason? Yeah.
So does the argument depend on whether the learner can manage to distinguish subjects from objects based on either case marking or thematic plausibility?
Sure. Well, I don't know how well, okay, so you can construe it that way, right? But you can also say whether grammar can parse it or not. I don't care whether I understood or not. If it parses it, I'm fine. I don't really have a firm commitment to how what the child is actually doing. But as long as you can look at this, you can get this effects of, transparent grammar and string incompatibility. That'll be fine.
Well, it seems like I understand the general framework, but does this particular story only work if you assume that that when the child hears a particular word order, they have no that the unfitness of the grammar is only about whether it can parse it, not whether it can find a parse that makes sense.
Let's say you find a parse that makes sense. I don't think it changes anything. What do you mean by by makes sense?
I mean the question of whether if they're having trouble if they see something which is ambiguous,
Right.
Syntactically ambiguous between
Right.
the two grammars.
Okay, so
They
that's
get
what I
an
mean.
error signal because this thing was under one parse is claiming
Right.
to be a subject,
Right.
on the other is claiming to be an object, and it's not agentive enough to be
Okay,
a plausible
okay,
object.
okay.
And so the question is, if the kid is smart enough to do that,
Okay.
does V2 have to get lost?
That's more of a language acquisition problem, right? So basically you're saying for SVO grammar, right? So no, I don't think the learner is that smart. I think the learner really processes languages, sentences on the online basis, such that if you pick that's why some of the grammars, I'm not talking about it here, but that's why some of the non-target grammars take so long to get knocked out. Okay, so if you really based on whether you understood the string or not, right? So, and then you wouldn't be able to predict why some of the errors like subject drop end up in the child language for so long. But this is for something else. Maybe I should just move on.
Let's take off.
Right. So here's another case. I think this is probably more interesting because this is more live than the dead French case. So this is the a lot of you have it, a lot of you don't. This is the famous cot-caught merger. Again, I don't have it, so I'm merged, so you can't tell the difference. But this green area is generally, this is based on the latest survey of North American English. This is the general area where the two vowels are merged, namely they sound the same. Over here, over this area or this whole area, all this O becomes more like that. But in California, this has become more like that over here. Right? So even though you have merged, they merge to different targets. Okay, so here's a sample of what it sounds like. This is a graduate student of ours who's from the Boston area, so he has a merger.
I pronounce cot the same as cot.
Okay, so Baltimore would be an area that doesn't have this merger, so you would actually hear this is sort of your standard, West Coast, sorry, not the West Coast. I mean, I guess the standard American, pronunciation where it's from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary online.
Cot-caught.
They're very different. Okay, so those are the second case is clearly even for me there are different vowels. I simply don't have. For English, I don't have the vowel here for caught. Anyhow, mergers are very interesting. They're being very heavily studied for following reasons. One is that mergers where you obliterate the pronunciation difference between two words, at least at some level, seem to contradict the idea that language changes or functions as a way of facilitating communication. Bill LeBeau has made this point against functional approach to language and language change at many places. The other thing that's interesting is that the merger are generally below the social linguistic radars. Okay, it's a lot of features of language that are socially prominent. So, for example, Bill LeBeau's own work on the famous R dropping in New York. But mergers are one of the things that people just go on as if they have no social awareness of the differences. Certainly are not aware of one form are considered more standard or more prestigious. The other thing is that mergers, unlike some other things, you can always learn a new word or you always learn new construction in language is something that generally acquired very early. So there's a work going back to the 70s where some features of the Philadelphia vowel system cannot be acquired by anyone who moved to the area after the age of 6. And mergers are certainly among the best documented linguistic changes in historical linguistics. There are lots of mergers. There are relatively few phonemic splits, so two vowels, one vowel that end up being two. And finally, this is important, mergers are rarely, if ever, reversible. So once two vowels have merged, they don't tend to go back to their old way. All right? So here's a case that's Dan Johnson, who did his thesis at Penn a few years ago, discovered. So he went to the area at the border of Boston, Massachusetts and Providence. So Massachusetts, eastern Massachusetts at least, had the merged system. So cot and cot are the same there. But Providence actually had a distinct system. So the two vowels are different. And so he found, so that's as a first degree of approximation, all in COT and CAUGHT have merged to the second one. This is the case in the Boston area. And the evidence is that the merge has spread to the non-merged towns at the border, which originally patterned with Rhode Island. And this is the reason they say this is a very fast change is that in some families, in one town, in one town he surveyed, in every family he surveyed, the older siblings had the parents' old system, namely distinct system, but younger siblings had a new system. Okay, longer siblings are merged, and so the conjecture here is that the two towns of this, one is Seekonk, right at the Massachusetts and Providence and Rhode Island border. This is South Attleboro, which is slightly closer to Massachusetts, a little further north of there. And so the conjecture here is, which is a sensible one, is that the children are being, at home they're learning their parent system, but somehow they go out there, they interact with the peers who speak with this merger, and they sometimes they learn it. They learn a new one, and then they're going to stick with the merged system. So the idea here is that merge is really spreading through migration. So this is a case where the new variant is introduced as externally as a migrant. So here's the learning situation, right? So you're at home. Your parents have the N- system, which is the unmerged system. You learn their system. But now you go into the population of your peer group, where it's going to be a mixture of N+ speakers as well as N- speakers. And let's say initially the mix has a probability of there are proportional P0 of the merged speakers and Q0 of non-merged speakers. And then you do the same thing as we said earlier. You do the calculated probability. After one generation, you get this. And these are the probabilities of these grammars being punished or rewarded, as I'll come to in a moment. So if this, let's say enough of merged speakers, namely, if after learning P1, namely, is greater than Q1, so P1 is now the dominant one, as the evidence is showing that the children seem to make a categorical jump, then they learn N+, otherwise they retain N-. Okay, so that's the learning situation. Only difference here is that in phonemic systems, it seems like our children are willing to make a radical cut. I'm going to either go one way or the other. It seems intuitively somewhat difficult to maintain always in a limbo, with your phonemes. And so here's this is, again, merge has been extremely well studied, and this is some examples taken from Bill LeBeau's work, where he documented dozens of miscommunication tokens by speakers. So here is Gillian Sankoff, a colleague of ours, who is an M+ speaker. She's Canadian. All of Canada has been merged. And she said it would be even better if Don could take her to the airport. Bill LeBeau, who's from New Jersey, which is not merged, thought she meant Don, who was actually happened to be a person in our department at the time who was blind. And so he was wondering how Don could take anyone to the airport, right? So in fact, here's a catalog of those errors, about 30 or 40 naturally occurring miscommunication, either he experienced himself or reported to him by other linguists. It turned out that a listener using the N- grammar, namely using the distinct grammar, actually have a far greater probability of failing than the N+ listener. This is going to be important. I'll come back to this later on. It's by ratio about 4 to 1. Okay, so here I'm going to actually not looking at the probability of you resulting in a failure of communication, but rather consider the processing of phonological ambiguity in an online fashion. Okay, there's various work that try to deals. So you know, for example, this paper in Brain and Language showed that one of the southern mergers, the so-called pin-pen merger, actually make, if you have the dialect, actually you have to work more than you don't have the dialect in order to understand words in an online fashion. So this is very much, I'm going to say, something like a garden path. If the phonological information miscues you, then you have to retreat and revise the analysis. The probability of you being misled by a phonological system is going to determine the fitness of those two grammars. So not strictly speaking the failure of communication, because as we know, in most cases we can understand, we can figure out what it means. So I'm talking about a very split second kind of delay in lexical processing. So this draws from two studies that are somewhat counterintuitive. So let's say this down and down thing, you'd imagine from intuitive point of view, the context is going to be enough to disambiguate. That turned out not to be the case. So here's a study by David Sweeney, a very prominent paper. It shows that lexical processing at a very early stage appears to be largely autonomous and largely phonologically driven. The context factors come in much later. So here's the original study. The rumor has it that for years the government building has been plagued with problems. The man who was not surprised when he found several spiders, roaches, and other bugs in the corner room. So this is your word sense disambiguation task, right? So what they did is a word cross-modal priming task. So the subject hear this passage, but at the very moment they hear bug, they will flash on the screen of words like ant and spy. And there's also a control word like so. Okay, so what they found is that you get actually a great facilitation and more importantly, equal facilitation for both the meaning of ant and spy. Whereas clearly one meaning is contextually appropriate, but not the other one, right? So this means that you can't count on the context to get rid of the ambiguity, at least not instantly. So both readings are actually available. Now the question is, if you happen to be misled by the phonological information, you have to retreat and then revise. That's where the cost is going to come in. So here comes from the literature on homophone processing. Okay, there's one paper that's generally relevant here is that homophone processing shows frequency effects. So if you take a homophone words in English like NU and non versus NO and E, which is non, they sound the same. This is a lot more frequent than this one, right? But if you if you ask people to name pictures of a noun, they do this with the same speed as naming a word that has the same frequency as noun, but do not seem to benefit from the presence of a homophone. That's far more frequent. So that's one finding. The most relevant finding here is that to compare two homophones, because here you can't name a picture that really noun, right? You have to find pictures. So here in French they have the study of looking at processing latency. So pardon my French. So something like verre, which is glass, is homophonous with the word for worm. Okay, so this is also a picture naming task where they give people a picture of glass, and people said this word a lot faster than people said the word worm, even though glass is actually not as visually salient as a worm, right? So, and this is argued to reflect the effect of their frequency. And that's all we need to do to get a picture going. Okay, so now you have four possibilities. I'm assuming if you get in contact with merger speakers very early, you can entertain the possibility of a merger system. Initially, you're going to be exposed to a mixture, P0 and Q0. Okay, now you have four possibilities. Every time you can pick a grammar to analyze one of the two types of grammars, and then pick some other grammars. You have four possibilities. And so what you do is you calculate the expected probability for reanalysis or disambiguation that has misled you due to the phonological processing effects of homophones. So you do this, so that gives you the penalty probability of those two grammars. You use this plug into the equation to get P1 and Q1. You get and since the learner is doing a a winner take all kind of thing, and then you're going to take the one that's going to have a greater value as your as your grammar. So crucially, the data here is taken from looking at those homophone pairs, provided to me by Bill LeBeau, and estimate their frequency. But you can really use any large enough corpus to get the frequencies. As we'll see, the advantage for a merger system is so decisive that even though some of the frequencies may show corpus particular property, it may not matter so much. So here's what happens. Okay, let's imagine you're using the merged grammar to analyze your environment. Okay, so this is a bit of a handful. So you hear some people use the M plus system, and some people use the M minus system, right? You only hear one vowel. So namely, either O or AW is going to sound AW to you, right? So if you hear someone talking about using the merged system, one is meant as DON, D-O-N, one is meant as AW, right? Let's assume also one of the forms is going to be more frequent than the other. Okay, so they have to be one. So if that's the case, then if you access the more frequent homophone first, now if the meaning is actually meant as D-O-N, you're good, right? If the meaning is actually meant as D-A-W-N, you have accessed the wrong meaning, you have to revise it and change it. So that's the probability of you failing. And so here's a case where you are listening to someone who has a distinct system. So they have two vowels, but since you only have one, you can only hear one. Okay? And so if it's actually meant as D-O-N, and since those two forms sound exactly the same to you, you're always going to be accessing the more frequent one first. Right? So here, even you didn't hear it right, you actually understood it right. And here, of course, you're going to fail because you're accessing the less frequent form. So the probability of the M minus the M plus grammar, namely the merger grammar, failing or triggering misanalysis is going to be the sum of the smaller probability of those minimal pairs, right? Now let's look at the other case, which is somewhat more complicated. So now you're using an unmerged system, trying to analyze this mixture. So here, since you have two vowels, they are somewhat mutually confusable. So the mutual confusability probabilities are given from taken from the Peterson-Barney study. Bill LeBeau has some other refinement of this, but I'm assuming these are inherent acoustic or perception properties of the human language. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Are you claiming that people who have the merger cannot tell the difference between people who? I mean, I don't have the merger, so Dawn.
Right.
You can't hear the difference between those two things?
This is what the social linguistics have shown. They have various tests of perception tests, and measurement tests, and gating experiments and so on. They have shown that. Yeah.
Is that even true for people who acquire the merger as adults?
That I don't know. So when people move around, and some people are more sensitive to those things than others. But even though the claim here is not they can't hear the difference, this is really a split second decision. When you have only one phoneme, and you're trying to hear two, you're basically trying to hear allophones and so on. Generally you're not, you may be able to make the distinction based on semantics or based on this and that, but phonologically it's not going to give you that information. So that's why the studies are done with words in isolation. But then, as we have just seen, context does not play a role, at least not immediately. So here you get a bit of more complicated combination. Now the same as before, you hear the merger, the merge system. And this is meant as DON, this is meant as DAWN, right? So I'm only go through it here. But you hear AW because that's the only vowel you have. You hear two vowels, right? So but the two vowels sound the same to you because it's spoken by a merged speaker. So the probability of you misheard AW as O actually is going to work out for you because I'm assuming DON is a more frequent form. So this is a case where you misheard, but you've actually got it right. And this, I'm not going to run through the whole gamut here for you, but of course you hear the merged speakers, the unmerged speakers talking. The probability of you failing is simply the inherent probability of you failing to identify the vowel, the vowel accurately. So you add up all the terms here, you get the probability of m minus grammar fading is going to be this expression. And critically, is this expression, all the FOs and FWs are constants. I'm assuming those are word frequencies. But you have a term here which is P0. If you go back to the earlier slide, this one is a constant. P0 does not play any role here because you won't have one vowel. So what you do is, unlike the French case where they're constants, here you have the fitness values are sensitive to their frequencies, at least one of them. So this is, of course, in biology, frequency dependent selection. And also, unlike the French case, you don't drag out over many generations of everybody being a little bit m plus or a little bit m minus. So here's a case where you make a decisive point based on the winner take all kind of thing. So you calculate P1 the function of P0 as you plug in the values we had earlier. You set this value to be greater than 1.5. You solve for P0, and then you get the necessary amount of migrants that's required for this merger to take over. You solve this, 0.22. Okay, so that means that if you go to the field and if you look at the community of learners, if more than 20% of the speakers are merged, then that means that this merger is actually going to take over the entire population of learners. So let's see what the data shows. So here's a more refined picture. This is South Attleboro. This is Seekonk. So he described 3 stages. First, not many merged parents in the community. Small number of merged children will learn the distinction from their peers. And also more merged parents move in. The proportion of natively merged children entering peer group, not enough to stop natively distinct children remaining distinct. Finally, the proportion of natively merged children exceed Y, where he postulated the threshold, because this is what the behavior on the field is showing. While distinct children may not be in a minority, they have enough contact with the merged peers that they lose their distinction. Okay? And empirically, South Attleboro, probably being a little closer to the Boston area, reached the stage 3, namely the merger is going to take over about 10 years before Seekonk. So what I'm suggesting here is, if you look at this, is that if there are less than this magic threshold or tipping point, everybody is going to acquire m minus. If it exceeds this tipping point, everybody is going to acquire m plus. You basically have some sort of bifurcation. So here's what Dan Johnson found. He said one thing that's very strong is that children with one merged parent and one distinct parent were usually merged. So if the parent is talking, let's say, more than a quarter of the time, that's going to happen. And it's certainly the case where before children enter the peer group, they tend to learn virtually everything from their parents. And then the most revealing study is actually to go to the school board and to look at the demographic composition of school children at the time of when the mergers were happening. Okay, so to look at how many of them are from, say, the Boston area, how many times to look at the parent composition, assuming before entering the peer group, everybody acquired their their parents' grammar. So it turned out that for Seekonk, this is roughly the period at which the merger, the amount of migrants have reached the threshold. Then that's when this merger is going to take over. In Seekonk, which, as I said, is a more advancing this changing merger, there is the threshold actually a lot earlier. So, okay, so I want to say the 20% here, hold on a second, the 22% here are done without looking at the change data, because it's done only based on word frequencies as well as the mutual confusability of those two vowels, so things that we can estimate synchronically as precisely as possible. Yes?
Yeah, so is the data about children that they've merged, is that production data?
What?
Or is it perception data? So does a child who has one merged parent and one distinct parent fail to hear it?
Those two tend to go together. Those two tend to go together, based on their various behavioral tests.
So Johnson tested on perception.
Right. Yeah. Right. And production. Right. It's like 600 pages of a thesis, and which is actually coming out as a monograph for American speech. So you can go beyond the field, a little bit. So this is getting more tentative, right? So why do we have to have this asymmetry for miscomprehension for the merged versus unmerged speakers? For merged speakers, as we know, you're simply taking the smaller frequency of the two, of the minimum pair. So in a normal communication case where, let's say, a merged speaker and a non-merged speaker talk roughly equally frequently, the probability of the distinct system misleading you is actually going to be a lot higher than the other one. This is why I think the error tends to go strongly one way rather than the other. Because misanalysis, if you recover the misanalysis, you don't have an error of miscommunication. If you don't, you do have an error of communication. This also probably accounts for that mergers are spread very, very quickly. So this is a case where it's spreading over 2 years, 2 or 3 years. And Ruth Harris' study was in primarily northern Pennsylvania, where this also is a cot-caught merger spread very, very quickly over the span of 10, maybe 20 years. She attributes that to a large influx of miners who had a merger into this area. So why do you, and possibly you can even say why mergers are hard to reverse. As you can see, if you're in a distinct area, let's say for only the cot-caught merger, you need 20% of new people to kill the old one, right? But now to reverse it, you need, in a population of merged speakers, you need 4 times of the migrants speaking the distinct system coming in order for this pattern to reverse. That may not be very plausible. It may be possible, but it's probably not very plausible, which probably why you don't see this very often. And finally, I want to add a point that the mutual confusability is a factor, but may not be as critical, because if you merge system again, you only penalize when you have the lesser of the frequency, right? If you're never miss here, then the probability of you going is going to be some frequency of one of the two pairs, which is always going to be the greater than adding the smaller of the pair, number of the pair together. So if you set this number to mutual confusability to be 0.01, you need 40%. If there's no confusability, you still don't need the majority of the speaker to be merged in order for this to spread. I have one more thing that's more tentative. This is a lot more tentative. Look at the pin-pin merger, which is something that happens mainly in southern United States, but it has spread into pockets of other places. So this is a map that shows sort of roughly around south of this line. You have almost all the major areas to have the pin and pen merged, except in major urban areas like Atlanta or Miami and also New Orleans, I think. There are pockets of elsewhere. So the minimal pairs here are ding din, ting ten, green jane jan, ping pan, jim jam, bing bang, and so on. So there's a list of all those things. Again, you get the mutual confusability probabilities from the Peterson and Barney data, and you do the same thing, right? I mean, so now you have a different set of word frequencies. You have a different mutual confusability, and you do this. You need about 32%. Okay, so what I'm trying to show is that this is a general model. You can look at other cases of similar changes. The data on this is unfortunately not very good, because this happened in the past. That this merger in this area became about complete about 50 years ago, if not sooner. It's probably even sooner than 50 years ago. 60, 70 years ago. So you can only rely on fairly indirect dialectal data rather than the thing that you actually can go there and see. Yeah.
So how does this jive with the story you told us just a second ago, where migration was driving a lot? So in the last 50 years, there's been a huge influx from the north into the southern United States.
Right. But where to? I mean, that's right. So that's why this major urban centers are resistant to the merger is actually relevant, because you look at all the rural areas, they're complete. They're actually very much complete. So all the blue dots here are the major areas, major cities, right? So again, the data here is not great, but we can do something. Here's a paper by Vivian Brown from American Speech the data is from dialectical surveys from Tennessee from 2 periods, and also North Carolina. I don't know enough about the background, but it's apparently the case that the dialectical change in North Carolina was very similar to Tennessee. The main point here is that you have a period of a stretch about 50 years where the change, the proportion of merged speakers in the population did not change all that much, and then it seems like after a certain threshold has been reached, then very quickly in roughly the same span of time, the merger drove to completion. So again, the data here is not great, but it suggests the way to look at the phonological change as mergers and as a means of spreading through the population may have something to do with this idea looking at a critical threshold, which we can compute entirely from synchronic data. So I'm going to wrap up. I should thank a few people. So this work is possible for me who doesn't speak English, doesn't speak French, maybe English too, doesn't speak French, and certainly doesn't have the merger. And it's only made possible by people who have compiled this data here. Ian Roberts for French, and Dan Johnson for the cot-caught merger case. And certainly, that's the typo. That's embarrassing. Discussion with Bill and Gideon Sankoff at Penn. So I want to wrap up with one slide here. One thing we can think of is one question I get is that, well, how come not all the vowels are merging all together, right? So the one thing you can see is that if processing homophones reflect a frequency factor, then if you have too many words that merge together, then then a lot of words are going to be delayed, right? So one of the things I'm looking at now is that whether we can actually test the limit of homophony. So how much? So maybe after a while, because you have too many homophones, the merged system becomes less favored than the other. So that's one way we're extending this work. But the main thing here has been trying to port these models and these concepts from mathematical biology into study of language change. And the more optimistic thing is that maybe we can use these models to guide the work in the field to look at other cases of language variation, change, processing, acquisition, and so on. This certainly has worked out extremely well for the biologists. The models here I'm sketching out are mathematically very simple, and even the more complicated models were worked out well before the 1970s. But we need to find the right linguistic grounding in order to apply this model in a meaningful way. So I've made the advertised estimate for predicting language change, but only a fool would predict the future. So I'm only predicting the past. And if I can do that, that'd be pretty good. Thanks. Paul?
So I think that your results are sufficiently convincing that I'm not challenging your interpretation here, but asking a question sort of at a different level, which is, you have a story under which the fitness is better for a language that does not communicate distinctions.
Yes.
Okay. And there's something a little odd about that.
Right.
The fitness of the language
Right.
that makes no distinctions
Right.
is greater.
Right.
You have your listeners using frequencies to disambiguate,
Mm-hmm.
and presumably in a more realistic model, they would be using all sorts of other
Right,
stuff
right.
besides frequency to disambiguate. So why would a language bother to make any contrasts?
Well, so it's kind of this limit of homophony thing, right? So if you don't make any contrast, you have a lot. So here you have this minimal pairs with only 2 words, right, that are ambiguous. Let's say if you merge 5 vowels, right, you end up with like 100 words that are homophonous, right? So if you really show this, frequency effect, so you're always going to go for the most frequent homophone. So most likely you're going to be wrong. So that's the case where you have too much homophony, then the merged grammar will start to get less fit. Okay, so this is why I'm trying to explore where you find the balance. I mean, so in this case where you have a homophone for these, minimum pair of 2 words, you get this effect. But when you have more homophones, namely more merged system, or language that marks less contrast, there's going to be a point where that grammar is going to be less fit than a grammar that makes more contrasts, or one more contrast, or one more distinction. So that's when I think this kind of process of merging is going to stop, and you have a language.
I was just wondering, basically, if there's some factor like, information content, of the contrast, which is basically computed something like how often you would be wrong if you used the most frequent thing,
Right.
not knowing that bit of information.
Right.
Whether that is some sort of breaking factor that's not explicitly in the model, but maybe could be.
Right. I think that's actually a nice thing to explore. This is, the second half is basically, what I learned from Bill Labov in the past 2 years, right? So these, he has various reasons to be dismissive about this, things like, functional load and so on. And some of the arguments I don't quite understand, but, for this, I think this is, this sort of more mechanical and localist kind of way of looking at the online, processing, facts. And they're simple enough so you can sort of, work out the numbers. Yeah.
So I wonder how this fits with the fact that when a child learns 2 languages simultaneously, and in some of them,
right,
you may have more phonological distinctions when the other one you don't. Would that predict that you would learn the simpler language less?
That's a very good point. Yes, in some ways. So Ann Cutler and Jack Mailer over the years have looked at various cases of completely balanced bilinguals, right? And it turned out that they actually have one, looking at some aspect of phonological processing, one language actually happens to be more dominant. And here's another study that I didn't have time to go through. So here is the case where, where is it? Right, way back. This is Laura Bosch and Nuria Sebastian. Oh, that's right. Right. So this is a paper where they showed that there's some nasal vowel, contrast in Catalan, right? So you look at, so the monolingual Catalan, infants actually learn it sooner than Spanish and Catalan bilinguals at birth. Okay, so seems like in some cases they eventually learn it, right? But it seems kind of a case where one form is probably more dominant, even though from impressionistic or even various behavior tests, those 2 populations behave just like native speakers. So this is where their argument is that there's actually only one language, even for people who are perfectly bilingual.
But wouldn't you predict that this distinction will be lost in Catalan speakers because they're being exposed to Spanish most of the time?
Depending on how, bilingual is somewhat different. And we really drawing a distinction, between 2 languages where you certainly wouldn't expect, certainly bilingual kids mix up the language, the core properties of grammar to some extent, but it's not like they're completely confused. When you have a bilingual case, it's different. So it seems like they are at least being able to draw lines somewhere. But this is one language where everything else is the same. Even the vowel systems are the same, except this particular set of 30 words. And so that's where I think the competition is going to be playing out. Yeah, no question? Oh, yeah.
It's more than an observation. I'm a New Yorker, and I've seen 4 generations in my family vowel systems follow an almost predictable social vector. And I guess I don't know where that fits into your equation. The fate of the vowel systems, including is pretty predictable from social factors, social values. Well, my understanding is this is what they tell me in a social linguistics lab. So here's a case where so I guess 2 answers, right? One is that from what I know, at least from what I read about, this doesn't seem to be one that, according to studies,
That doesn't seem to be one that's registered on the social radar. On the other hand, that could be part of the calculation as well. Let's say some vowel forms are more favored for for social reasons, right? Then possibly you can tweak the penalty of those grammars accordingly, and that'll change the dynamics of of this of course. But I think in principle it can be incorporated in this kind of model. All right, Paul again. Yep. Okay.
Nobody else has a question?
Yep.
You commented about how V2 is historically rather unstable, and you talked about why it would lose out to SVO
In pro-drop languages, yeah.
in pro-drop
Right.
languages. And I was wondering, it seems to me your argument doesn't work so well for an SOV language competitor. So if you drop the subject in the SOV language, you still have something which, you now have something which is ambiguous, V2, if the object is Romanian. So it's no longer the case as there was for SVO that pro-drop makes a lot of data that otherwise would be evidence for V2, no longer evidence for V2.
Okay.
So I'm just wondering if it's the case that
Right.
we're having competitions between V2 and SOV.
And SOV,
going
right?
the
So,
way.
right. We can toss it in and crank out some numbers, right? So, right. I didn't consider this because this is one parametric change, where you're holding other factors of the language to be constant. Let's say if this is let's say we hold pro-drop constant, but we manipulate V2 and base order and basic word order, right? So you got, say, in principle, 4 grammars. So it would be equivalent of competition, at 2 loci, right? So you can work that out, and
But that's more complicated. I
Right.
had in mind just between V2 and SOV, no SVO.
V2 and SOV. And if you
Yeah,
have
so
pro-drop,
the two
right?
languages in contact are SOV and V2.
Right.
Whether there's a different trajectory.
Right. SOV and
There
V2.
has to be pro-drop for your kind of language.
Right. Right. So V2 and SOV. So drop the subject, you end up with OV, which is only actually OV pattern is possible in a Germanic language, but only I think 1 to 1.2% of the data. So I think SOV with the pro-drop is not going to fare very well against V2 because virtually everything V2 is okay. So right. So if you drop the pro-drop, is only you're counting for 1% of the of the V2 data. So I would imagine V2 to beat out SOV under the case where they both have pro-drop. We'll have to see, but but it's something that's I think that's worth writing down the expressions and see how the numbers come out. Right. All right. Thanks very much.